The most famous scene in Disney history isn't just a tragic moment, it's a crime scene. And like any good detective story, the devil is in the details that everyone missed. Picture this. Mufasa clings to the edge of Pride Rock, his claws scraping against stone. Below him, wildebeest thunder through the gorge in a carefully orchestrated stampede. Above him stands Scar, supposedly the mastermind of this elaborate plot. But freeze this moment. Really look at it. Because what we're seeing isn't the execution of a perfect plan. It's a series of coincidences that went horribly wrong. Start with the basics. How did Scar know exactly when to position himself at the top of the gorge? The stampede was already in motion when he arrived. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and Mufasa wouldn't be there. Too late, and the opportunity would be lost. Yet Scar shows up at precisely the right second, almost as if he was summoned. Watch his face in those crucial moments. Frame by frame, Scar's expression tells a different story than the one we've been told. When Mufasa first grabs the ledge, Scar's eyes widen. Not with satisfaction, but with what looks suspiciously like surprise. His mouth falls open slightly, the way someone's does when they witness an unexpected accident. This isn't the face of a calculating villain watching his plan unfold. This is the face of someone who just realized they're in the middle of something much bigger than they anticipated. The physical evidence doesn't add up either. Consider the logistics of orchestrating a wildebeest stampede with split-second timing. These aren't trained circus animals. They're massive, unpredictable creatures with minds of their own. The idea that Scar could predict exactly when they'd reach the gorge, exactly when Mufasa would arrive, exactly when the rescue attempt would fail, it's not just unlikely, it's practically impossible. But here's where it gets interesting. Scar's infamous line, "Long live the king," has been interpreted as a villain's triumphant moment. But listen to how he says it. There's no joy in his voice, no satisfaction. If anything, there's resignation. It's not the declaration of a conqueror. It's the last words of someone who knows they're about to cross a line they can never uncross. The real smoking gun, though, is in what happens immediately after. Watch Scar's reaction when Mufasa falls. A true mastermind would be composed, ready for the next phase of their plan. Instead, Scar staggers backward, his eyes fixed on the spot where his brother disappeared. He doesn't move for several long seconds, precious time that could have been used to establish his alibi or begin damage control. This is shock behavior, not victory behavior. Even more telling is what Scar does next. Instead of immediately claiming leadership or rallying the pride, he lies to a cub. He tells Simba that it was all his fault, that he should run away. If Scar had truly orchestrated Mufasa's demise as part of a grand plan to seize power, why would he send the heir into exile instead of eliminating the threat entirely? Why create a story that makes himself look like an opportunist rather than a rightful successor? The conventional narrative wants us to believe that Scar spent years plotting the perfect regicide, but the evidence suggests something far more disturbing. Scar wasn't the author of this tragedy. He was just another victim of it, trapped in circumstances beyond his control and forced to play a role he never auditioned for. Look at the scene again with fresh eyes. Notice how the hyenas are conspicuously absent from the clifftop confrontation. They orchestrated the stampede. They were supposed to eliminate Simba afterward, but when the crucial moment arrives, when the supposed mastermind finally gets his hands dirty, they're nowhere to be seen. It's almost as if they didn't want to witness what was about to happen. Or perhaps they already knew how it would end. The most damning piece of evidence isn't what Scar did, it's what he didn't do. A true villain would have prepared for this moment, would have savored it. Instead, Scar hesitates. He reaches down toward Mufasa, and for a split second, it looks like he might actually try to help. His claws extend not in attack, but as if to grab hold. Only at the last moment does something change. A realization, perhaps, or a whispered instruction we couldn't hear. This wasn't the climax of Scar's master plan. This was the moment when Scar realized he'd been played by forces much more cunning than himself. The moment when he understood that he wasn't the puppet master, he was just another puppet, and someone else was pulling the strings. But if Scar didn't plan this perfectly timed assassination, if he wasn't the criminal mastermind we've believed him to be for decades, then the question becomes infinitely more chilling. Who was? The answer lies not in what we saw, but in what we were meant to see. every great magic trick relies on misdirection, making the audience look at the obvious suspect while the real culprit operates in plain sight. And in the Pride Lands, someone had been practicing this particular trick for a very long time. Think about the level of intelligence required to orchestrate what happened in that gorge. It would take someone who understood animal behavior intimately, someone who could predict the movements of both predator and prey with scientific precision, someone who had access to information about the royal family's routines and habits, someone who could manipulate events from behind the scenes without ever getting their own paws dirty. Scar may have been many things: jealous, bitter, opportunistic, but criminal mastermind was never one of them. He was always more of a complainer than a schemer, more likely to grumble about his circumstances than to actively change them. The elaborate death trap in the gorge required a level of strategic thinking that Scar had never demonstrated before or since. But someone did demonstrate that level of cunning, someone who managed to coordinate a complex series of events with military precision, someone who understood that the best way to commit the perfect crime was to make sure someone else took the blame. The evidence has been hiding in plain sight all along, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Not, how did Scar do it? But, how did Scar get manipulated into doing it? Not, what was his plan, but whose plan was he really following? Because the truth about Mufasa's fate isn't just about one moment of betrayal on a cliff. It's about a conspiracy that goes deeper than anyone realized, with players who have remained hidden in the shadows for far too long. The most overlooked piece of evidence in this entire case isn't physical. It's psychological, and it comes directly from Scar's own mouth, in a confession that reveals far more than he intended. When Scar finally tells Simba the truth about that day in the gorge, he's supposedly confessing to the perfect crime. But listen carefully to his words, and you'll notice something odd. His story doesn't match his personality, his capabilities, or even basic logic. What we're hearing isn't the boastful admission of a successful mastermind. It's the desperate fabrication of someone trying to maintain a lie that was never his to begin with. "I triggered the stampede," Scar tells Simba with theatrical conviction. But think about this claim for a moment. How exactly does one trigger a stampede of that magnitude? Wildebeest don't just spontaneously panic because a single lion shows up. They're prey animals, yes, but they're also massive creatures who travel in herds specifically for protection. It takes either a serious predator threat or a significant environmental disruption to get an entire herd moving with that kind of coordinated panic. Yet Scar presents this as if it were as simple as pulling a lever. No explanation of the mechanics, no acknowledgement of the incredible timing required, no mention of the extensive preparation such an operation would demand. It's the kind of oversimplified confession you'd expect from someone who was told what happened, not someone who actually planned it. Even more revealing is what Scar doesn't confess to. He claims responsibility for the stampede and for letting Mufasa fall, but he never mentions the most crucial element: how he knew Simba would be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The entire plan hinged on Simba being in that gorge when the wildebeest came through. Without that, there's no reason for Mufasa to be there, no rescue attempt, no tragic confrontation on the cliff. So how did Scar know where Simba would be? His confession is conveniently silent on this point. He doesn't claim to have lured Simba there, doesn't mention manipulating the cub's routine, doesn't even acknowledge that this was a necessary component of his supposed master plan. It's as if this crucial detail simply happened by magic. Compare this to Scar's actual demonstrated abilities throughout the rest of the story. This is a lion who struggles to hunt effectively, who can't maintain order in his own kingdom, who requires constant support from the hyenas to accomplish anything of significance. His reign is characterized by poor planning, reactive decision-making, and a general inability to think more than one step ahead. Does this sound like someone capable of orchestrating an elaborate, multi-part assassination plot? The psychological profile doesn't match either. Scar's defining characteristic isn't cunning. It's resentment. He's a reactor, not an actor. He complains about his circumstances, he envies others' success, but he rarely takes initiative to change anything himself. Even his alliance with the hyenas seems to have been their idea, not his. Throughout the entire story, Scar is consistently portrayed as someone who follows opportunities rather than creating them. But perhaps the most telling aspect of Scar's confession is the timing. He doesn't reveal the truth until he's cornered, defeated, and desperate. This isn't the proud admission of a successful villain. It's the last-ditch effort of someone who's been backed into an impossible situation. And notice what happens immediately after he confesses. He tries to shift the blame to the hyenas. It was their idea, they made me do it. This isn't the behavior of a mastermind taking credit for his greatest achievement. This is someone desperately trying to find a way out of a story that was never really his to tell. The inconsistencies pile up when you examine Scar's relationship with the hyenas more closely. Throughout their partnership, who's really in control? Scar makes promises he can't keep, agreements he doesn't understand, and decisions that consistently benefit the hyenas more than himself. He's not their leader. He's their front man, their legitimate face in a world that would never accept them otherwise. Watch the dynamic between them carefully. The hyenas don't defer to Scar's authority. They tolerate his presence. They don't wait for his orders. They inform him of decisions that have already been made. When problems arise, they don't look to him for solutions. They handle things themselves and tell him about it later. This isn't the relationship between a criminal mastermind and his subordinates. This is the relationship between a useful idiot and the people using him. Even Scar's famous musical number, Be Prepared, reveals more than it intends to. Yes, he's making grand pronouncements about his plans for the future, but listen to the specifics. He talks about what will happen after he becomes king, not how he intends to make that happen. The actual mechanics of removing Mufasa from the picture are left conveniently vague. It's all when I'm king and my reign will be, but precious little about the steps required to get there. This isn't a villain outlining his master plan. It's someone who's been promised a throne and is fantasizing about what he'll do with it. The hyenas provide the choreography, the timing, the muscle. Scar provides the royal bloodline and the plausible deniability. He's not the architect of this conspiracy. He's just another tool being used by the real masterminds. The most damning evidence comes from Scar's own emotional state throughout the events. A true mastermind would be calm, collected, ready for each phase of their plan. Instead, Scar is consistently agitated, uncertain, and reactive. When things go according to plan, he seems almost surprised. When complications arise, he panics rather than adapting. This isn't someone who's in control of events. This is someone who's struggling to keep up with them. But if Scar wasn't the mastermind, if his confession was just a desperate attempt to maintain a fiction that was never his creation, then who was really pulling the strings? Who had the intelligence, the resources, and the motivation to orchestrate such an elaborate scheme while ensuring that someone else would take the blame? The answer has been laughing at us the entire time, hiding behind a facade of simple-minded brutality while demonstrating a level of strategic thinking that puts most apex predators to shame. The hyenas knew something Scar didn't. They knew exactly who was expendable in this arrangement, and it was never going to be them. The greatest trick the hyenas ever pulled was convincing everyone they were stupid. But intelligence in the animal kingdom isn't measured by philosophical debates or mathematical equations. It's measured by survival, adaptation, and the ability to outmaneuver stronger opponents. And by that standard, the hyenas weren't just intelligent, they were brilliant. Consider their position in the Pridelands ecosystem. Hyenas are naturally scavengers, relegated to the margins of society, denied access to the best hunting grounds, and forced to live off scraps. They're physically weaker than lions, outnumbered by the herbivores they prey upon, and universally despised by every other species. By all rights, they should be extinct. Instead, they've not only survived but found a way to seize control of the entire kingdom. This wasn't accomplished through brute force or lucky accidents. This was the result of a sophisticated long-term strategy that played out over years, possibly decades. The hyenas understood something that everyone else missed. In a monarchy, you don't need to be the strongest to rule. You just need to control whoever is. Look at how they first approached Scar. They didn't come to him as supplicants begging for scraps. They came with an offer, a proposition that made him feel powerful and important. "We'll make you king," they promised, "and all we ask in return is access to the Pridelands." It seemed like they were offering him everything he'd ever wanted in exchange for something that cost him nothing. But notice what they didn't promise. They didn't promise to serve him once he became king. They didn't offer to be his loyal subjects or his faithful army. They simply offered to put him on the throne. The details of what happened after that were left deliberately vague, allowing Scar to assume he'd be in control while they made very different plans. The stampede itself reveals the true extent of their capabilities. Coordinating that many animals requires an understanding of herd behavior, predator-prey dynamics, and precise timing that goes far beyond simple scavenging instincts. Wildebeest don't stampede on command. They have to be driven to panic by exactly the right stimuli applied at exactly the right moment. Think about the logistics involved. The hyenas had to know Simba's location in advance, predict Mufasa's response time, account for variables like weather and terrain, and orchestrate the entire sequence without leaving any evidence of their involvement. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime of passion. This was a military operation planned with the precision of a special forces strike. Even more impressive is how they managed the aftermath. Within hours of Mufasa's demise, the hyenas had seamlessly integrated themselves into Pride Rock society, taken control of the hunting grounds, and established themselves as the real power behind the throne. This wasn't opportunistic scavenging, this was a prepared takeover by an organized force that had been planning this transition for years. But their masterstroke wasn't the assassination itself, it was the setup. By positioning Scar as the apparent mastermind, they created the perfect scapegoat. If the plan succeeded, Scar would be their puppet king, taking all the public responsibility while they wielded the actual power. If the plan failed, Scar would take all the blame while they melted back into the shadows, innocent scavengers who were simply following orders. Watch how they interact with Scar throughout his reign. They don't defer to his authority. They inform him of decisions that have already been made. When he complains about the state of the Pride Lands, they don't scramble to fix problems. They explain why the problems don't matter. They've effectively neutered him, turned him from a king into a figurehead while they run the kingdom according to their own agenda. Their long-term vision was breathtakingly ambitious. They weren't content with just overthrowing the existing order. They wanted to completely restructure Pride Land society with themselves at the top. The traditional hierarchy that kept them on the margins would be demolished and replaced with a system where scavengers ruled over everyone else. It was a complete revolution disguised as a simple coup. The most chilling aspect of their plan wasn't its scope, it was its patience. They were willing to let the Pride Lands deteriorate, to watch the ecosystem collapse, to endure years of scarcity and hardship, because they understood that revolutions require sacrifice. They were playing a generational game, willing to accept short-term suffering for long-term dominance. Even their apparent defeat reveals their strategic thinking. When Simba returned and challenged Scar, the hyenas didn't immediately rush to defend their puppet king. They waited to see how the confrontation would play out, ready to adapt their strategy based on the outcome. When it became clear that Scar was finished, they didn't hesitate to eliminate him themselves, cutting their losses and preparing for the next phase of their plans. This wasn't the impulsive behavior of simple scavengers. This was calculated damage control by experienced strategists who understood that in politics, loyalty is always temporary, but survival is permanent. The evidence of their intelligence is everywhere once you know what to look for. Their communication network rivals anything in the animal kingdom. They coordinate hunts across vast territories, share information instantaneously, and execute complex group strategies with military precision. Their social structure is more sophisticated than most realize, with clear hierarchies, specialized roles, and collective decision-making processes that put them closer to wolves than to the simple-minded carrion eaters they pretend to be. But perhaps their greatest achievement was psychological. They convinced an entire kingdom that they were harmless idiots while systematically dismantling every institution that stood in their way. They were apex predators disguised as comic relief, revolutionaries masquerading as opportunists. The tragedy of Mufasa's fate wasn't that he was betrayed by his brother, it was that he never saw the real threat coming. While everyone focused on the obvious family drama, the hyenas were executing a flawless coup that would have succeeded permanently, if not for one variable they couldn't control: the return of a son who was supposed to be gone forever. But even their failure reveals their competence. When their carefully constructed system finally collapsed, they didn't go down fighting. They disappeared. No dramatic last stands, no desperate revenge plots, no bitter recriminations. They simply vanished back into the shadows they'd emerged from, ready to wait for the next opportunity. Because that's what real masterminds do. They survive, they adapt, and they prepare for the next game. And somewhere out there in the Outlands, they're still laughing at how completely they fooled everyone. But they needed one final piece to complete their plan. Someone on the inside who could provide the information and access that even their extensive intelligence network couldn't obtain. Someone with intimate knowledge of the royal family's routines and habits. Someone trusted enough to get close to the targets without raising suspicion. The hyenas were brilliant, but they weren't omniscient. No matter how sophisticated their intelligence network, there were certain pieces of information that could only come from someone with intimate access to the royal family. Someone who knew Simba's daily routines, understood the pride's security protocols, and could predict how different members would react under pressure. The morning of the stampede, several key figures had access to crucial information that would make or break the hyenas' plan. Each one becomes a suspect when you start asking the uncomfortable questions that everyone else was too grief-stricken to consider. Start with Zazu. The majordomo's entire job revolves around monitoring the royal family's movements, coordinating their schedules, and maintaining security protocols. He knows where everyone is supposed to be at any given time, and more importantly, he knows when they deviate from those plans. On the morning in question, Zazu had detailed knowledge of both Mufasa's patrol route and Simba's unsupervised adventure time. But here's what's suspicious: Zazu's convenient absence during the critical moments. Where was he when Simba wandered into the gorge? Where was he when the stampede began? For someone whose job is to keep track of the royal family's whereabouts, he demonstrates a remarkable ability to be elsewhere when disaster strikes. The official story is that Zazu was detained by the hyenas, a convenient explanation that puts him in the role of victim rather than accomplice. But consider the timing. The hyenas knew exactly when and where to intercept him, almost as if they'd been given his flight path in advance. They didn't hurt him, didn't interrogate him, just kept him busy long enough for events to unfold elsewhere. Even more telling is Zazu's behavior afterward. For someone who supposedly failed in his primary duty to protect the royal family, he shows remarkably little guilt or self-recrimination. No desperate attempts to make amends, no visible grief over his perceived failure. He simply moves on, adapting to the new regime with suspicious ease. Then there's Rafiki, whose late arrival to every crucial scene borders on the mathematically impossible. The wise mandrill has an uncanny ability to show up just after the action concludes, never quite in time to prevent tragedy, but always perfectly positioned to provide sage commentary on what just happened. Rafiki's network of informants throughout the Pride Lands is legendary. Birds, insects, small mammals, they all report to him with remarkable efficiency. Yet somehow, this extensive surveillance system failed to provide advance warning of a massive wildebeest stampede or a coordinated hyena operation. Either his intelligence network is far less effective than advertised, or he chose not to act on information he possessed. His behavior during Scar's reign is equally puzzling. For someone supposedly loyal to the royal lineage, Rafiki demonstrates remarkable passivity in the face of obvious tyranny. He doesn't organize resistance, doesn't attempt to restore legitimate rule, doesn't even try to contact Simba until years after the exile. It's almost as if he was content to let events play out according to someone else's timeline. But the most disturbing possibility involves Sarabi herself. The queen's emotional detachment in the aftermath of her mate's demise is striking. While grief affects everyone differently, Sarabi's response seems less like mourning and more like resignation, as if she expected this outcome, had perhaps even prepared for it. Consider her position in the pride's power structure. As queen, Sarabi had access to information that no one else possessed. She knew Mufasa's patrol schedules, understood his protective instincts regarding Simba, and could predict his responses to various scenarios with intimate accuracy. She also had reason to feel resentful. Years of being overshadowed by her mate's legacy, relegated to a supporting role while he received all the glory and recognition. More suspicious is her behavior during Scar's confrontation with the Pride. When he claims that Simba is responsible for Mufasa's fate, Sarabi doesn't immediately defend her son or demand evidence. She doesn't ask the obvious questions or challenge the convenient narrative. She just accepts it as if she already knew what had happened and had made her peace with it. But the evidence points to someone even more unexpected, someone whose access was complete, whose motives were complex, and whose opportunity was perfect. Someone who had been feeding information to the hyenas for years, not out of malice, but out of a twisted sense of justice. The real inside collaborator was someone who felt that the existing power structure was fundamentally unfair, that the Pride needed new leadership even if it came at a terrible cost. Someone who believed that Mufasa, despite his noble intentions, was ultimately holding back progress and change. Someone who saw the hyenas not as enemies but as potential agents of necessary transformation. This insider didn't set out to orchestrate regicide. They simply provided information and access, believing they were facilitating a political transition that would ultimately benefit everyone. They told themselves they were working for the greater good, that sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, that the ends would justify the means. The sophistication of the hyenas' operation makes perfect sense when you realize they had detailed intelligence about every aspect of the royal family's operations. They knew when Mufasa would be alone, when Simba would be vulnerable, when security would be lightest. They knew because someone with complete access was telling them everything they needed to know. This wasn't a betrayal born of greed or ambition. It was ideological. The collaborator genuinely believed that change was necessary, that the old ways weren't working, that sometimes revolution requires sacrifice. They convinced themselves that they were serving a higher purpose, even as they enabled one of the most devastating crimes in Prideland's history. The most chilling aspect isn't the betrayal itself. It's how easily it was rationalized. The insider didn't see themselves as a traitor or a criminal. They saw themselves as a reformer, a progressive voice pushing for necessary change in a conservative system. They believed they were helping to create a better future, even if that future required some unfortunate casualties along the way. But ideology is a dangerous thing when it blinds you to consequences. The collaborator thought they were facilitating a smooth transition of power, not enabling a catastrophic breakdown of civilization. They expected gradual reform, not complete collapse. They wanted change, not chaos. By the time they realized what they'd actually helped unleash, it was too late to reverse course. The hyenas had what they needed. Scar was in position, and Mufasa was gone. The insider could only watch in horror as their vision of progressive reform turned into a nightmare of ecological disaster and social breakdown. The evidence has been hiding in plain sight all along, waiting for someone to ask the right questions and connect the obvious dots. Because the truth about Mufasa's fate isn't just about one moment of betrayal, it's about a conspiracy that involved multiple players, each with their own motivations and justifications, all serving the interests of masterminds who understood exactly how to manipulate good intentions for evil purposes. The most devastating truth isn't always the most obvious one. After examining all the evidence, analyzing every suspicious behavior, and connecting every thread of this conspiracy, the identity of the insider becomes terrifyingly clear. It wasn't someone acting out of malice or personal gain. It was someone who believed they were serving a higher purpose, someone whose wisdom and foresight had been trusted for generations. Rafiki, the mystical advisor to the royal family, wasn't just a witness to history. He was one of its architects. Think about it logically. Who else had the combination of access, intelligence networks, and ideological motivation necessary to facilitate such an elaborate scheme? Rafiki's role as spiritual advisor gave him intimate knowledge of every member of the royal family. His network of animal informants provided real-time intelligence about movements and activities throughout the Pridelands. Most importantly, his position as a wise elder meant his advice and guidance were never questioned. But Rafiki had seen something that others missed. He'd watched the Pridelands stagnate under traditional leadership, seen the rigid hierarchy prevent necessary change, witnessed the growing tension between different species as resources became scarce. In his mystical wisdom, he'd foreseen a future where the old ways would lead to collapse and extinction. The hyenas approached him not as enemies, but as fellow revolutionaries. They didn't want to destroy the Pridelands. They wanted to transform it into something more egalitarian, more sustainable, more just. They painted a vision of a kingdom where scavengers and hunters could coexist as equals, where the artificial barriers between species would be eliminated, where survival would depend on contribution rather than birthright. Rafiki found their arguments compelling. He'd lived long enough to see the flaws in the monarchy, the injustices perpetrated in the name of tradition, the slow decline that came from refusing to adapt. When the hyenas asked for his help in facilitating a transition of leadership, he convinced himself he was serving the greater good. His contribution wasn't dramatic or obvious, it was subtle and systematic. A word here about Simba's favorite hiding spots, a suggestion there about Mufasa's patrol routes, a casual mention of when security would be lightest. He told himself he wasn't enabling violence, just providing information that would help ensure a smooth transfer of power. The morning of the stampede, Rafiki knew exactly what was going to happen. He'd provided the intelligence that made it possible, helped coordinate the timing that made it successful, and positioned himself to arrive at the scene just late enough to avoid preventing it, but early enough to manage the aftermath. His theatrical grief was genuine. He truly mourned Mufasa's passing. But it was the grief of someone who'd convinced themselves that sacrifice was necessary for progress, that sometimes individual tragedy serves collective advancement. He'd rationalized the cost as acceptable collateral damage in service of revolutionary change. But Rafiki hadn't anticipated the complete breakdown that followed. He'd expected the hyenas to implement gradual reforms, to modernize the kingdom while maintaining basic stability. Instead, he watched in horror as they stripped the Pride lands bare, showing no interest in sustainable governance or long-term planning. They weren't revolutionaries, they were opportunists who'd used his idealism to facilitate their own power grab. By the time Rafiki realized what he'd enabled, it was too late to reverse course. Scar was firmly established as a puppet king. The hyenas had consolidated their control, and any attempt to expose the truth would only create more chaos. So he did what wise advisors do when their counsel leads to disaster. He waited for an opportunity to correct his mistake. Simba's survival provided that opportunity. Rafiki's sudden interest in finding the exiled prince wasn't driven by loyalty to the royal bloodline. It was driven by guilt and the desperate need to undo the damage he'd helped create. His mystical discovery of Simba's location was actually the culmination of years of careful monitoring and planning. This revelation reframes everything we thought we knew about Scar's role in these events. Far from being the mastermind of an elaborate conspiracy, Scar was perhaps the most manipulated victim of all. The hyenas used him as a frontman, Rafiki used him as an unwitting accomplice, and history used him as a convenient scapegoat. Scar's confession to Simba takes on new meaning when viewed through this lens. He wasn't boasting about his criminal genius. He was protecting the real conspirators by taking sole responsibility for their collective actions. Whether out of misguided loyalty, crushing guilt, or simple self-preservation, Scar chose to bear the entire weight of blame, rather than expose the complex web of manipulation that had led to his brother's demise. The moral implications are staggering. If Scar was merely a weak-willed pawn manipulated by more sophisticated players, then his decades of vilification represent a fundamental miscarriage of justice. The real architects of Mufasa's fate escaped accountability, while their most visible collaborator became the face of evil in Prideland's history. But perhaps the most haunting question isn't about justice. It's about necessity. Would exposing the truth have changed anything? Would knowing about Rafiki's betrayal, the hyena's intelligence, or Scar's manipulation have brought Mufasa back? Would it have prevented the ecological collapse that followed? Would it have created a better outcome for anyone involved? Sometimes the most dangerous truth is the one that serves no constructive purpose, that only destroys without building anything in return. Maybe Scar's willingness to accept blame wasn't just cowardice or manipulation. Maybe it was the final noble act of someone who understood that some secrets are too devastating to reveal. The Pridelands eventually recovered from their dark period, finding new balance under Simba's leadership. The hyenas retreated to the margins where they belonged. Rafiki resumed his role as trusted advisor, and the official history settled into comfortable certainties about good and evil, heroes and villains. But late at night, when the Pride Rock is quiet and the stars shine down on a kingdom at peace, you have to wonder, how many other truths are actually carefully constructed lies designed to protect us from realities too complex and disturbing to acknowledge? The greatest villains aren't always the ones history remembers. Sometimes they're the ones it chooses to forget, the masterminds who fade into the background while their pawns take center stage. And sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is accept blame for crimes you didn't commit, carrying the weight of others' sins so that the world can continue believing in simple stories about right and wrong. Mufasa's real killer wasn't Scar. It was a conspiracy of good intentions gone wrong, revolutionary ideals corrupted by opportunism, and wisdom blinded by arrogance. But that truth is too complicated for a children's story, too nuanced for clear moral lessons, too disturbing for audiences who need their villains pure and their heroes untainted. So Scar remains the villain, Rafiki remains the wise advisor, and the hyenas remain simple-minded scavengers. The real story stays buried beneath layers of convenient fiction, known only to those brave enough to ask the questions that everyone else is afraid to answer. Because sometimes the most important truth isn't what happened. It's why we choose to believe the lies that make us feel better about what happened. And in the Pride Lands, that particular truth is more dangerous than any stampede.